Let's turn these quilt extras into something new. I am very lucky that we have welcomed another baby into the family, so I really wanted to make a teddy bear Lovey for them. So the first thing I did was match up my leftover pieces with a piece that I thought would look good with it so that I could make the squares for the quilt for the bottom part of this Lovey, because it's kind of like a little blanket with a stuffed animal on top. You'll see when we get to the finished product, but I just sewed all of these rectangles together and press them so that I can cut them into the squares that I'll use to make my little mini quilt. I then cut all of these strips into 2-inch pieces. I went with a really simple design, just taking the same patterns from the same rectangle and just inverting them to make these little square rectangles. So once I have all of my designs set, I'm going to sew them all together to make one big quilt. To attach these pieces, I just lined them up at the seam. So where the dark blue meets the light blue, I wanted that to be perfectly the same. Added a little clip, and then I'm going to sew it together. This process just continues to get repeated until I have my full block. This is what our finished block should look like, and I'm just going to do this to all of the fabric patterns that I have. Once I have all of my blocks ready to go, it's important to press open the seams so that they lay flat once they're all connected and attached to the batting. Something I've learned the hard way in previous quilts is that it's really important to square off all of your pieces before you sew them together. In the sewing process, these edges kind of get a little out of whack, or maybe I didn't cut them perfectly straight the first time. So it's super important to just square off all of the edges so they're all the same size and they all have a flat edge to then attach them all together. I am actually using a pattern this time to create this. So what I did was I just took my rectangles and roughly placed them onto my pattern to get an idea of how I wanted this little mini quilt to look, so that I could sew it all together and then cut it out. Now that I have my finished design, it's just time to sew all of the rectangles together. Again, I'm just matching up the seams, and that's how I'm going to sew them all together. Here's what that looks like, and I just have to do that for the rest of the quilt. I have my finished quilt top, so what I'm going to do is just press open all of the seams as flat as I can to ensure that when the quilt is fully together, the top is nice and flat. The next thing I did was lay out my quilt top and put the pattern back on top so I could cut it nice and straight and make sure I have the exact size that I need for the bottom of this little teddy bear Lovey. It was a little hard for the rotary cutter to cut through all of the seams, so I'm just going in with my scissors and making sure to get all of those edges off. It's now time to add the batting. So what I'm doing is I'm just pinning them together, the quilt top and the batting, so I can take it to the machine and sew them together. After quilting the top, it's time to cut off the excess batting and also square off the quilt to make sure that all of the edges are perfectly straight. The reason there is so much batting is because as you quilt the top, it moves a bit, so you want to have a little extra. I also learned this the hard way on a previous quilt. I did not give myself enough extra batting, and the quilt moves too much, and sometimes you run out of batting if you don't leave yourself enough. So here I'm just squaring off all of my edges, and on some of the edges I am cutting off a little bit of the quilt. To make this a true mini quilt, we need a backing. I'm using this really soft, stretchy material. It's like a sage green. I don't know if it's really coming up in true color on camera, but all I'm doing is just pinning it together so that I can cut it out into the exact shape. Now the reason that I am cutting this exactly to the quilt size, and I didn't do the same thing that I did with the batting, I didn't quilt it together with the batting, is because I'm going to be attaching this backing in a little bit of a different way. I'm going to be attaching it right sides together and just sewing around the whole quilt, leaving a small opening to turn it inside out, so that when it's all flipped the right way, everything's all attached and all the seams are on the inside and I don't have to do a binding. As you can see, I left this little opening here where I'm going to turn my quilt right side out. Once my quilt is all right side out, I'm just pressing the edge to prepare it for a top stitch. And here is the finished quilt, and we are finished with the first half of the construction of this Lovey. I decided to use the backing fabric as the top fabric for the Lovey. So the top part of it is going to be a little bare, and I thought using the same fabric would just kind of tie it together. And this fabric is super, super soft and delicate, so it's perfect for a baby. Here I just cut them all out according to the pattern, and I'm going to sew them together. Off camera, I decided to stitch the face onto the bear. It took me forever to figure out the way that I wanted it to be, but I think it came out really cute, and I was even able to add his initials to the back of it. Now, I did use a pattern. Did I follow the pattern? No. So I ended up having to seam rip my little mini quilt so that I could add the Lovey to the quilt from the inside. Now that doesn't really make sense. I'll show you here. I have to actually cut a hole in my quilt top, but not in the bottom part, only the quilt top. So the backing does not get cut. I have to cut a little hole so I can stick the Lovey through and sew it all together. So that's what I'm doing here. I had to seam rip so that I could get to the inside of my quilt. So now I just have to stuff the bear head so that I can stick it inside of that hole I just made in the top of the quilt and sew it down, and then we're almost done. Now that the bear is attached, I just have to close up the hole that I made. The last and final step is just making sure that the backing is now attached to the quilt somehow so it doesn't just hang down. So what I did was I actually took embroidery floss and I put it through the middle where the bear head is. So the seam allowance of the bear head, that's what I'm sticking this thread to, just so that that backing doesn't hang really low and hang down. It's just attached to something. Usually we would have a quilted back, so we wouldn't have this problem. But since it's not quilted, I just wanted to make sure that it doesn't flop around everywhere. So I'm just adding a little kind of X and knot in the back. And here is our finished Lovey. I'm so excited to give this to our newest family member, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe.